Hi, everyone, and welcome to UBS Trending. I'm Anthony Pastore. So the song says, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. The Big Apple, the city that never sleeps. Without saying it, you know the city I'm referencing. Of course, it is New York City, where we are sitting right now. Well, the city that never sleeps took a bit of a nap in 2020, but don't count it out just yet. New York is on its way back, and in some instances, it's better than ever. So the question is, what is the future of New York City? In a new report from our Chief Investment Office, they answer that question. Joining me now are Salita Marcelli and Tom McLaughlin from the Chief Investment Office. Salita, always a pleasure to have you. Tom, welcome. Good to see you as well. And listen, congratulations, first of all, on this report. It is massive, and there's a ton of amazing information in there. And Salita, the question I wanted to start with you is, what compelled the Chief Investment Office to actually delve into the subject of the future of New York City and publish the Future of NYC report itself?
Yeah. First of all, great to be with you as well. Anthony, as we all well know, New York was the epicenter of the pandemic and certainly bore the brunt of the initial impact in terms of loss of lives, loss of businesses, and we saw suddenly people packing and leaving to suburbs because it was less dense, or maybe they needed more space while working from home. And at the time, there was all this talk in the media that maybe the future of work will be all remote. City living lost its shine in a post-pandemic world, and that New York City, as we knew it, was changed forever. And then last summer, when things started opening up, the claim was that New York was roaring back stronger than ever, even though we still had the pandemic very much with us. So what we wanted to do is really to look past these dramatic claims and provide a more level-headed analysis of where we see the future of New York, and of course the investment implications that come with that. And what we have found is that this city has been remarkably resilient in adapting to the pandemic. And even though it's still facing a number of challenges in the current environment, it also has unique attributes that's going to make this city thrive in the long term.
Mm-hmm. Look, I'm a New Yorker. I've lived here my entire life. I've never really left except to go to college. New York is a very resilient city, and New Yorkers themselves are as well. But obviously, it was tested with COVID. And as you spoke, Salita, I was remembering last summer being around the city and feeling really good about the vibes that were happening. But, it's still a bit of a waiting game. So, Tom, Salita is speaking about the city's resilience. We can all feel it and when we're around. But, we suffered from 9/11. We've suffered from other economic crises in the city. We've seen the city ebb and flow. So what did you see in the data, the recent data, that told you that this time New York will recover from the current crisis?
Well, it's interesting, Anthony. The dire predictions regarding the city's future have been a common refrain in 2020. And both you and Salita just mentioned the word resilience, and I think that's really appropriate. I think the rebound in demand in residential housing has been nothing short of extraordinary, and it may be the best forward indicator of New York's recovery from the pandemic. But what was really astonishing was how fast the residential market turned around in the space of just 5 or 6 months last year, say from about April into November. Landlords went from offering significant concessions to prospective tenants to almost curtailing the practice entirely. And you're certainly seeing fewer banners hanging from the various residential buildings in Manhattan offering 2 months free rent or whatever. After an almost 20% decline in rental rates in the space of, that summer of 2020, average rental rates hit an all-time high just last month. And vacancies are approaching pre-pandemic lows. Sales of co-ops and condos have accelerated. Unit sales, in fact, are at a decade high for both the general market and the luxury market. And the fact that both of those distinct markets are actually hitting highs is, I think, noteworthy. And this is all occurring, as Salita basically said, in the shadow of Omicron as it hangs over the city. As the variant subsides, the venues that define New York, from Broadway to music venues to sports arenas to restaurants, are all poised to make a comeback.
Yeah, and look, we could see the rates. You could follow the science as the Omicron has now dipped towards its lows since starting last December or late November. We were upwards of 25% positivity rate in most of the 5 boroughs. Now we're down at between 1.5 and 1.8, depending on which borough you're looking at. So there is a sense that Omicron is coming to an end. Of course, We don't know what other variants may follow, but it really does kind of help us tell the story here a little bit. And you touched on real estate a little bit, Tom. Clearly, when the pandemic first started, we saw this mass exodus of people leaving the city and going to more of these low-cost, low-tax states like Florida, Texas. How much of a threat does this pose to New York City, especially as a location for business? Because if people aren't here, they're not going to work here when that hybrid, not just working from home all the time, begins to kick in a little bit more.
Yeah, well, no, that's true. There was a certain degree of migration that occurred in 2020. Some of it was just to the suburbs of New York. Others were to entirely different states further south. There's a decade of data on internal migration to verify the trend that does exist, that individuals are gravitating towards states with both warmer weather and lower taxes. And Florida is a popular destination, not surprisingly, for both people and for income. And watching and following the income is actually critical. The latest data shows that for every dollar of taxable income that leaves Florida, $2 is actually arriving. But it's important to remember that New York City's economy is larger than 46 state governments, or 46 states in the United States. And it offers an array of cultural, financial, educational services that are difficult to replicate in most other parts of the country. The population drift poses a threat, but one that I think is manageable because of the vibrancy of the city. Other regions of New York State, upstate, for example, other states entirely are experiencing similar migration patterns, and to varying degrees. And most of them don't have the attractions that New York has to offer to either young adult professionals or senior citizens looking for proximity to services. So both the city and the state, I think, must focus their attention on the tax burden, which is a consideration as they ask residents to bear these taxes. But we've seen from the evidence that New York is able to reinvent itself, and the most recent data is suggesting that people are coming back into the city in order to basically re-domicile in anticipation of a kind of a reemergence or a resurgence in the local economy.
Right. Look, unless you've lived in New York, you really don't know what it's like to live in New York. Salita, I know you live in the city, and you don't live in New York for the spacious real estate. You live here in an apartment usually. You live here for the culture of the city, the entertainment, the restaurants, the activities, everything. So we know that New York City does remain a desirable place now that especially things like Broadway are back open and concerts are happening again. But what about the future of commercial real estate? Everybody went completely remote in 2020. Now there's a bit of a hybrid feel. What happens when we shift back toward a more hybrid, even maybe companies requiring employees to come back full time? What happens with commercial real estate here?
Yeah, well, Anthony, the future of work and office, I think, is a fascinating topic. And you probably could have guessed, but did you know that New York has more office space than any other city in the United States? About 11% of the total office inventory of the entire country. And I think there is still an important role that an office plays in terms of encouraging collaboration and innovation that technology cannot simply replace, right? Technology was a stopgap. It was a successful stopgap. It is going to continue to be part of our lives. But it's hard to imagine that it's going to replace that face-to-face human interaction that we need with our colleagues. Hence, I'm here next to you talking to you in person, right? So that is all good. However, we believe that there's going to be structural changes in the way office workers interact, right? Many companies are switching to hybrid work environment on a more permanent basis. And that means that there will be less need for office space. But at the same time, the desire to have more open, collaborative, larger space will partially offset that decline for the need to office space. Now that's one trend. More importantly, we believe that there will be a flight to quality by tenants to either new or recently renovated buildings that are more environmentally compliant, that have better amenities and more flexible workspace. In fact, in 2021, we already saw a significant uptake in premium office leases, which tells me that the trend has already begun,
right,
where tenants are willing to bear the high occupancy cost for quality. Look, I think it's striking that only 10% of New York's 450 million square feet of office space has been built since 2000. That means that there are a lot of old buildings, a lot of old office spaces that are going to be rendered obsolete in the post-pandemic world. So either they will have to be renovated, or given the shortage of affordable housing in New York City, potentially they will be converted to residential properties if the right incentives are placed. So the question, what happens to commercial real estate in New York City? When we look at the future of commercial real estate in the city, it seems to us becoming increasingly bifurcated, where new projects or renovations are going to be at a distinct advantage. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a positive note, because there's always a positive note, right? New York continues to attract educated workers with diverse career backgrounds. Traditionally, it has been the center of finance, real estate, and insurance, but it is also emerging as a destination for technology and life sciences. I should really add here that, Meta and Alphabet, right, the parent companies for Facebook and Google, have committed to large office spaces in New York City since the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a big deal. And it makes people want to come here even more. And look, you can see the history of New York. Tribeca 20, 25 years ago was mostly rundown old warehouses or canning factories, and now it's become this extremely desirable place to live. They turned a lot of those old factories into very expensive condominiums. And so you can sort of see, as you mentioned, these older buildings, who knows what the possibilities are. If you get somebody who's got a lot of ingenuity and innovation in their brain, they could turn that into something really, really special. So yeah, there you go. I like that, Salita. Thank you for sharing that with us. So Tom, I want it's almost a two-part question I have for you. When you look at the city's finances overall, how's it holding up as we're, almost exactly 2 years into this pandemic, especially given this higher demand? We've got social services, and look at the city's healthcare system. It responded to financial pressures. But how is it done with associating itself with COVID-19? How is the city done financially?
Yeah, interesting, Anthony. It's a bit of a paradox. The city's financial position is actually incrementally better today than it was in 2019. And a lot of that has to do with a massive infusion of federal financial assistance, which isn't going to come as much of a surprise. A lot of that financial assistance from the federal government was targeted towards education and healthcare, but there was enough of it so that by putting money into those two sectors particularly, it freed up a lot of latitude in terms of the city budget for other purposes. And it allowed the city to avoid the tax increases, which were basically being batted around as potential just 3 years ago. In addition to that, we actually saw the city establish a new rainy day fund for future expenditures that aren't contemplated or come as a surprise. The immediate challenge, I think, for the new mayor is the collective bargaining contracts. Half of those contracts have already expired. The remaining half, almost 100%, just shy of 100%, will expire by the end of the calendar year. The plan that the former administration put into place had anticipated that those contracts would not have a salary increase in years 1 and 2 of a 3-year contract extension. And given where inflation is right now, I think that's probably the biggest challenge that this new mayor is going to face, only because the collective bargaining units of the public employee unions are going to look at this and say, well, given the sacrifices that we've made over the last couple of years as frontline workers, we deserve something in return. So those contract negotiations will continue for probably the next couple of years. They will occasionally be contentious. But the current financial plan, as it exists today, is going to be revised over the course of the next 12 months. And I think it'll show a bit of strength because we've actually had some really great returns on the public pension fund, and that's going to allow the city to reduce its employer contributions and perhaps redirect some of those contributions to other purposes, including current salaries. The hospital sector you mentioned, and I think that's something we have to focus on. There were some pretty dark days in 2020, as we'll all recall, and doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals were on the front lines for us. But once you get past the personal sacrifices, which were very important to recall and to remember, when you look at the hospital system finances, there was a double whammy, if you will. On the one hand, they were basically obliged to respond to the trauma cases and the intensive care cases that were basically being brought to bear. We saw the first COVID case came in on March 1st. By the middle of April, the the pandemic epicenter was in New York, or one of the two epicenters in the globe. And it was a really rough time. So they had to basically respond with this intensive care. At the same time, all these perhaps more lucrative elective procedures, and I'm thinking here about hip replacements and knee replacements that actually generate a fair amount of net income for the hospitals, those were all deferred to another time. So it was basically a lot of expenditures were being made for the immediate response, which was absolutely necessary. A lot of the revenue that would have been otherwise incurred or received had been basically deferred.
Right.
What we're looking. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Tom. No, please continue.
No, I just think, but here again, I think federal aid made a huge difference, and the city's major not-for-profit hospital systems were able to respond very well to the uptick in cases in Omicron. What we found in New York is that there was a big spike, and that it's come down again since then, and that there were other areas of the country that have gotten hit harder. So on balance, this is actually a positive story now that we've got most of the worst effects of the pandemic behind us.
Right, and we can't thank the frontline healthcare workers enough for everything they have done and continue to do. One of the things I love about New York, one of the many things, is the solidarity we have as people who live here. Every day at 7:30, for most of the biggest part of the early part of the pandemic, people would get out and applaud and bang pots and pans for the healthcare workers, and the city would erupt every day at 7:30 at night. So again, look, we could sit here and talk about all the things we love about New York, living and working here, and debate the challenges, and heaven forbid anybody from outside of New York says anything bad about our city. We kind of go after them a little bit as New Yorkers. But so outside,
well, that's only because you're from Brooklyn, Anthony.
That's right. I'm a Bronx boy, so I defend the city. Salita, but as we're wrapping up, and by the way, the report goes into a lot of other areas like retail, entertainment, art, financial part of the financial industry that we sit in, education, sustainability. What implications does the Future of New York City report actually have, and what are the findings for investors? What are the investment implications?
The future of New York is a culturally relevant story, but as you said, it has investment implications. So, the trends that we have identified for post-pandemic New York are also, present elsewhere in the country, whether it be the transformation of retail commerce, disintermediation of traditional finance via fintech, or upgrading of buildings and infrastructure with a more sustainable focus. But New York gives exposure to all of these long-term trends for investors in one place, right? So in the equity space, you could buy REITs with a concentration of New York residential and commercial real estate as a way to play the developments in the real estate market. Of course, REITs are sensitive to rising interest rates, so it might be a bumpy road for investors in 2022, but for long-term investors, it is still a good option. In the fixed income space, you can get exposure through taxable and tax-exempt bonds of New York City, municipal bonds. And just a reminder for New York City residents, those are triple tax exempt. And in the alternative space, we have options in private real estate and opportunity zones. In fact, we have published a companion report to our Future of New York report where we provide specific recommendations in each one of these areas for our clients.
Terrific. Tom and Salita, thank you so much. Again, congratulations to you and the team on putting this all together. More conversations to come on the future of New York City. Good to see both of you.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you. And for more information on the report and anything else coming out from the CIO and UBS in general, visit our website at ubs.com/views and make sure to follow UBS on social media. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also check out our past UBS Trending episodes on demand on YouTube, as well as ubs.com/studios. And as always, if you have any questions about your own portfolio, make sure to speak with a financial advisor. So until next time, I'm Anthony Pastore. We hope you have a great day, everyone, and remember to keep your eyes on what's trending. And come visit New York. The theaters are open and the restaurants are doing great. So can't wait to see you. See you soon, everybody.